Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Keeping Families Safe Online, Protecting Children from Identity Fraud and Cybercrime, which is being hosted by IRIS, powered by Generali. We're excited to have you all join us for this conversation, highlighting some research, some of the research, found in Javelin Strategy and Research, Child Identity Fraud, a Web of Deception and Loss. We're excited to have expert thought leaders from both Javelin as well as our very own IRIS, who will share some insights into the child identity fraud landscape and how specifically unrestricted access to the internet can put children at risk. We also are going to discuss some best practices for sharing personal information online and much more. I'm Eugenia Blackstone, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. I'm proud to be the Chief Marketing Officer for IRIS powered by Generali, which is a trusted identity and cyber protection partner to many Fortune 500 companies, including financial institutions, insurance carriers, and cybersecurity providers. At IRIS, we specialize in providing people-first, technology-forward identity and cyber protection services that are customized to fit a company's brand, creating a seamless experience that adds real value to our end customers. As I'm sure a lot of you are aware, today is Safer Internet Day, which makes this topic all the more fitting for a webinar today. You can find free educational resources on our website, like white papers, infographics, articles, and more that provide both businesses and individual consumers guidance around practicing safe and secure identity and cyber protection habits. Please visit irisidentityprotection.com for more details. So before we get started and dive into speaking with our excellent speakers today, let's go over just a few housekeeping items. The first is questions. Questions are welcome. If you have any questions at all as we go through today's webinar, please type them in the question box so that we can address as many of them as we can. We'll save the questions to the end, and if for some reason we're not able to address all the questions or you think of questions at the very end, we will be providing contact information at the end of the webinar so that you can still get your questions answered. And then finally, this webinar is being recorded and a link will be emailed out to all of the participants. So sit back, relax, listen, take it all in. Don't feel like you need to take detailed notes. You will get a recording of the webinar. So now that we have our housekeeping items out of the way, let me introduce you to you guys today's speakers, to our panelists. First, we have Tracy Kitten, who's the Director of Fraud and Cybersecurity with Javelin Strategy and Research. Tracy is a recognized fraud and cybersecurity subject matter expert within the financial services community. She's also a veteran journalist who's covered fraud, payments, financial technology, and cybersecurity for the past 16 years. Tracy has watched attacks and cyber threats evolve, having spoken at countless industry events, practitioners, and even sometimes hackers to anticipate what's coming next. We're excited to have Tracy join us today. So welcome, Tracy.
Thank you, Eugenia.
Additionally, we have Malcolm Webb on our panel. Malcolm is IRIS's resident team lead in our Resolution Center. On top of managing a team of identity theft coordinators and certified resolution specialists, Malcolm has assisted thousands of victims resolve a wide variety of identity theft incidents, striving to provide the highest level of assistance to IRIS's end customers by not only working with them to resolve identity theft incidents, but also providing educational resources before an adverse event has occurred. Thank you for joining us, Malcolm.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So with that, why don't we dive in and let's get started. Tracy, Javelin Strategy and Research recently released a new study on child identity fraud. Can you share some of the findings from that report with our audience here today?
Yeah, definitely. So next slide, please. Just walk you guys through some of the highlights from that report. And I'll just kind of say, Eugenia, while we're waiting for the slide to come up, this report published in October. It's the first time we've done a report like this. We did have a child identity fraud study that we had done a few years ago, but just given that the landscape has changed so much, we're really kind of decided that we're going to change our methodology and start from ground zero. One of the things that was really interesting about the findings that we gathered in July, August of 2021 was the impact that the pandemic had. And you mentioned earlier safe online behaviors. The online behaviors obviously are a big piece of it, right? So we find that when children are online, they're definitely at much greater risk, which I'll walk through here in just a moment. But I'm very excited to see what results we get in 2022, right? Because we still have a lot of children working remotely. A lot more parents are still working remotely. Everyone is online a lot more, so the vulnerabilities are definitely still present and great. I don't know, are we having issues with the slides?
I think we may be having a little bit of technical difficulty. Give us just a moment here to see if we can get advanced to the next slide.
Okay.
In the meantime, I know that until we can get the slide moved along, I did have the opportunity to take a look at some of the research, and I know that we found a number of things. Number one, that there is really a lot more, I think, child identity fraud going on than the average person realizes. And so I think that that may be one of the eye-opening, results for consumers.
Yeah, I was going to say we could just talk about the losses overall, and thank you. Nearly $1 billion was lost in the past year. And again, I mentioned we gathered our survey results in July, August of 2021. So we would be looking at, we were asking these households to respond based on the last 12 months. And what's most frightening about that, Eugenia, is that this is just the fraud we know about, right? There's a lot of child identity theft and fraud that's taking place that parents don't find out about until years, sometimes decades later. You can see here, 1 in 50 children in the US in the past year was affected by child identity fraud. 1 in 45 children had their PII, their personally identifiable information. So this would be something like a social security number, a date of birth, was exposed in a breach in the past year. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is just the risk that we put children in when they're online. It's not practical to say that we're not going to allow children to be online, especially since so many children are learning remotely and the internet is just part of everyone's everyday life. And I'll delve into this in a little bit more deeply on another slide that comes up after this. But basically, you can just see here how risky it is for children to be online. So education plays such an important role. Resolution is costly. So in addition to the loss, the fraud loss itself, you also have the amount of time it takes parents to resolve child identity fraud, as well as the out-of-pocket expense they have to help resolve fraud, which could include anything from having to hire an attorney to just investing in different types of services that will help them recover those funds. So you can see here that it takes about 4 hours longer to resolve child identity fraud than it does traditional adult identity fraud, and that the out-of-pocket resolution costs are about $400. And I'll delve into this a little bit more deeply as well, but we really do see that social media puts children at significant risk. And we also find that unmonitored internet access also puts children at significant risk. The good news is that education and safe online behaviors actually are just as effective as not having internet access at all, which I'll show on a later slide too. Next slide, please.
It may just be a little lag with the slides here. So, oh, there we go.
Yeah, and this just kind of reiterates, what I kind of highlighted on the first slide. One thing I think that's worth noting here is that if you look at the average loss linked to child identity fraud for a single U.S. family, it's roughly $740. And then if you tie that in with the resolution costs, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at more than $1,000. In isolation, that might not sound like much, but when you think about collectively, especially if you had more than one child in your household, that was affected by identity fraud, that could add up rather quickly. And again, as I mentioned, this is just the fraud that parents or guardians know about. And Eugenia, I know you and I will have some discussion about this later on, and I'm sure Malcolm will touch on this as well, but there's a lot of this going on out there that we're not even aware of. And oftentimes this is because children, aren't telling parents what they're doing. Parents aren't monitoring their internet access. I know we're all guilty of getting a little bit lazy with iPads and what children are viewing online on their YouTube channels. But again, it's a very frightening environment, and it's getting scarier with each passing day. Next slide, please.
And to that point, Tracy, I mean, this is certainly this dialogue is not meant to make parents feel attacked or bad or anything. I have kids, you have kids, and we've talked, offline about the struggle of staying on top of what they're looking at online, how quickly they move from screen to screen. And, it really is something that you have to be, very, very mindful of and stay on top of, because it is very difficult to keep eyes on them 24/7, but not doing so can have some unintended consequences.
Yeah, and I think, oftentimes let's lead by example, right? I mean, if we practice safe online behaviors, if we don't overshare on our own social media platforms, we're setting a good example for our children. And that was one of the things that we found in the study, was just putting too much information out on social media, accepting friend requests from people you do not know personally in real life, IRL. This is what puts children at greatest risk. So just educating children and talking with them about safe online behaviors, is really the key, right? Because you can't monitor what they do 24/7. So that's a very good point.
Yeah.
I can guess, while we're waiting for the slides, I'll just kind of speak anecdotally about some of that, and then once the slide, there we go. So you can see here the social media does put children at significant risk. We found that 18% of the households where a child over the past, we looked at households because we wanted to be sure we had enough data. We looked at over the last 6 years, did you have a minor in the house that had personal information compromised? So you can see here that those who were on social media were much more likely to have their personal information compromised, 18% versus 8% who did not use social media. Now, again, to Eugenia's point, we're not trying to make parents feel badly. I think in today's environment, it's very difficult for a child not to have internet access or to have some kind of social media presence, but it's just the educational piece that's so critical, which I'll delve into here in just a moment. Next slide, please.
While we're waiting on that, I think one of the things that we're going to talk about is that all social media platforms aren't created equal, right?
Exactly. So here, and I just want to put a disclaimer on this. This is not to say that these social media platforms were themselves breached. It's just that children on these social media platforms had their personal information exposed in a breach somewhere else. The message from Javelin, the message that we want to get across is that you can see here that just having a presence on these social media platforms just puts more information out there about your child, and the more information that's out there on these social media platforms, the more likely it is to be breached somewhere. You can see here that Telegram obviously seemed to be the most common social media platform that was being used that resulted in a child having some kind of personal information compromised. But to your point, Eugenia, one of the things that we're getting across in this report is that we deem certain social media platforms riskier than others, even if we just take the percentages out of it. Facebook, as an example, is one that we deem to be particularly risky. Most social media platforms allow direct messaging, but any social media platform that allows for DMs, direct messaging to a child, is concerning. Also, if you can send a friend request where you can follow each other, which most social media platforms do that, it's risky. But what makes Facebook, we feel, the most risky, or at the top, is because you have such a wide range of age groups on Facebook. You have grandparents, friends with parents, friends with their grandchildren, their children, their aunts, their uncles. And so if a child has an identity compromised, if they have a profile on social media compromised, you could see how easily that compromised profile could be used to compromise other people in the network. So again, it's a scary environment, and we've all heard about Facebook and some of the risks associated there just from a psychological standpoint. So again, all social media platforms pose risk, but some definitely are riskier than others. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, so just looking at the internet access, right, which I think ties in with the use of social media. The good news is that we know it's not really practical to completely eliminate internet access, especially in today's environment where you have so many children working remotely. But the good news is that just with some education and some monitoring, keeping an eye on what your children are doing, we found that it was just as effective at preventing a child's identity from being compromised in some kind of data breach or that child experiencing ID fraud. It was just as effective as not having any internet access at all. So you can see here that 23% of the households that we surveyed who did not monitor internet access had their children's personal information exposed in a breach. 18% of those households with unmonitored access had a child who suffered from some kind of identity fraud. And then it significantly drops when you look at internet access that is monitored. So only 11% of those households had a child's personal information compromised in a breach, and only 6% experienced identity fraud. And you can see that's almost directly in line even to those households where they didn't allow internet access at all. So I think that's a very positive message, and one that really speaks to the power of education. Next slide, please.
Yeah, I was going to say that while we're waiting on the next slide to come up, the education is such a big, key point there. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, but I just wanted to mention, to see that the numbers become almost identical to not having access to the internet at all by simply, putting a bit of education on there is a delight to see, because like you said, most people can't in this day and age even, fathom, conducting yourselves in a way that does not include access to the internet at this point. And we certainly don't want to imply that, access to the internet or the internet itself is all bad. So, we're not advocating that you're bringing up kids with no internet access. It just shows the importance of making sure you combine that with education.
Yeah, and just to build on that a little bit, Eugenia, and I'll be interested to hear Malcolm's perspective on this as well. But, to tie back, we cannot watch what our children are doing 24/7. I mean, they're going to have unmonitored access to the internet. It's just the reality. So that education piece is so important, just because, and it's something that should really fall on parents, educators. It's really something that we need to adopt across the board.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I think, before we move on, or as we move on to the next slide, before we get ready to turn it over to Malcolm, I think now would be a good time to actually take a poll question. So if we could get the poll question loaded. So as a parent, what action did you take when you discovered your child's identity was compromised? And the audience here will be able to see the poll options up here, and we'll let it go on for about a minute. But again, one of the things that we can do, and I know Malcolm is going to speak to this, I have 2 small children, and one of the first things I did was to freeze their credit not long after I came back from maternity leave. And I think it's something that's fairly simple to do, but the average person doesn't think about, because I kind of live and breathe this every day. It was on the top of my list, but I think that that in itself was a really, powerful thing to be able to do to provide some protection to them. And so I'll be interested in seeing what folks said that they did kind of post discovering that their child's identity had been compromised, understanding that that is kind of a preemptive tactic or option that you can take, is to freeze their credit up front.
Yeah, credit freeze is definitely one of the best things that you can do. It's highly recommended. I think personally, my own opinion is that in the future, every child's credit will be frozen automatically until 16, because it doesn't make sense if they don't have their credit file until 16 and they have no need for a credit file, then why not just freeze it for everyone? But that's exactly the right thing you should do.
Yeah. Yep. And we can see the numbers come up here. The majority of respondents are saying 38% froze the credit. What I think is interesting is that 25% did nothing. And I think a lot of that has to do with people don't know what to do. Once a child's identity has been compromised, you can feel a little bit like, all right, well, it's too late now. And so I think some of the things that Malcolm's going to talk about coming up here will be helpful for that group that really, opted, that said there's nothing that can be done at this point.
And Eugenia, this is Tracy. I'll just add to this. I'm very pleased, however, to see that the majority of the respondents said they did freeze the child's credit, because one of the things that we found is that oftentimes parents don't even know that that's an option. They don't even realize that their child has a credit report, right? Or that they can even take this kind of step. So I think this is very promising to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's great. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think building on the excellent presentation from Tracy, I'm just going to talk a little bit about safeguards that people can place for their children and for themselves, protect your family. Like we just saw on Tracy's slides, children spend a whole lot of time online at a lot of these different sites, not just social media sites, but also shopping sites and public Wi-Fi access points. Children will go and log into the public Wi-Fi at different merchants, and they unwittingly provide a lot of their personal information to participate in these services. They give things like their name, their email, date of birth, location, their phone number, and all that information, once they provide it to sign up for a service, it actually gets stored in the cloud. And so what that means is that it's stored in a third-party company's servers, potentially forever. And they're often unaware of the dangers of ID theft. And the thing about this information is that it's not just temporary information. If you provide your name and your date of birth and also your phone number, which you'll keep, that information will remain a part of your personal identity for many, many years. It's not going to change in the future. And so 10 years from now, if someone goes and they get your information that you provided as a child, maybe 10 years earlier, it could still be used against you. And children are not aware of that. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing is that, as Tracy was saying, it's not just the child's personal information, it's relationship information. So at a site, especially like Facebook, if someone is able to get into a child's account, they can find out not just information about the child, but information about the child's relationships, parents, relatives, friends, and they can use that information to perpetrate a variety of scams as well. So it's very important that children are made aware of the dangers of the information that they're providing. As Tracy was saying also with devices, children are using these devices all the time. And the thing about it is that your child could actually be in contact with an ID thief via their phone, and you might never know about it. Child might be on the phone at school, exchanging direct messages. They might just have someone follow them on their Instagram account, and they're happy about that. So maybe the person reaches out to them, and they will have no understanding of the fact that it could be someone from halfway around the world who's not a child at all, but it's just someone pretending to be a child, trying to contact your child to try and commit identity theft. The big key with all these services, though, is that it puts your child at risk of a data breach. When a child participates in these online services, provides their personal information, what that means is that their information is now being stored somewhere else with another company. And if that company is breached, your child is at risk, even though the child may have done nothing wrong. It may not be a situation where the child is giving the information to someone who's pretending to be a child. It may just be that they're cruising along using a service, and when that service gets breached, the child's information is exposed. And Tracy was talking about Facebook. Facebook had one of the biggest data breaches ever last year. 858 million individuals had their personal information exposed just because they signed up for a Facebook account. So it's something that children need to be made aware of, and adults, as parents, you want to be aware of that as well. All these different services that your children are signing up for, they're potentially at risk, not just because they're using the service, but because of the information that they provided to sign up for the service. Another thing to think about is that child identity theft is often committed by family members. Common scenario is divorced parents. They will have access to all the child's information. They'll have access to the child's devices. In many cases, one parent or the other may have actually bought the child the device. They may have very extensive access to all the information that's on that device. And you do see cases where parents are filing for benefits in a child's name when they shouldn't. Adding children on tax returns is a common scenario. Also, extended family members with access to the family's residence or the child's devices can also commit identity theft. So that's something that you want to think about and try and safeguard against. So given all these dangers that we've talked about, that Tracy's mentioned, that I've kind of glossed over here, what can you do to protect yourself? Next slide, please.
As we're waiting for the next slide to come up, Malcolm, this also makes me think about, I may be dating myself here a little bit, but back in college when I used to give out all of my information to the like free pre-approved credit card providers for a t-shirt. And I mean, to think back on how crazy that was now, how precious and valuable that information was now, and then to really kind of connect it to the new way of doing that. Essentially, you're doing that through the phone, and in seconds, in milliseconds, you're giving out the same type of pertinent, valuable information, and that children are doing this. And I was doing this, as a young adult, not really understanding the type of information I was giving away, but let alone now we're talking 5, 6, 7-year-olds that are able to accept terms and conditions, and 12 tweens that don't really understand what all that means. And so again, I think just goes back to understanding, yeah, we can't put our kids in a bubble, but it is really important to have those conversations with them, to educate them, and to kind of keep our eyes really open to what they're doing, what activities they're participating in online.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I would say it's even worse now because they have I don't know if you've seen contests where kids can enter contests, they can win prizes, and the offers that are presented to children, many times they don't realize that the real goal of the offer is to get their information. And yeah, it might be something very attractive, and a lot of this stuff can spread very quickly just by word of mouth. If kids hear about something, a contest that maybe their friends at school entered or something like that, they might go and just try it. Or if you download this app, then you'll get this. And I mean, there are all sorts of things being presented to children in a way that wasn't done in the past. So I think you're absolutely correct on that. But the slide is up. So looking at safeguards, what you can do as a parent to protect your family, protect your children. By far, the number one thing that I would say you want to, or actually, just to step back, there are a set of actions that are here that are parental actions that parents can take. And then there are a set of actions that you should take with third parties that we recommend you would take with third parties. But as Tracy and Eugenia have said, the actions taken by parents are more important in terms of educating your children and being aware of what they're doing. And by far, the number one thing that I would recommend is, as a parent, you want to make sure to keep your child's personal information secure. This is something that we see all the time, especially for younger children. The younger children don't always know their most critical personal information. Social Security number is the biggest one. Usually it's the parents that know that information. But I've seen many cases where the child's information is exposed inadvertently by the parents. And I'll just talk a little bit about that. The thing about the children's personal information, something like Social Security number, is that for your own Social Security number, you know what it is. You have it memorized, so you don't need to write it down. You don't need to store it anywhere because it's in your head. But if you have kids, you probably don't remember their Social Security number, especially if you have multiple children. You might not be sure what it is. And so what many parents do just out of necessity is they store that information in some fashion. And you want to think carefully about how you do that. I'll talk about a couple. There was one case that I remember very vividly. There was a woman, and she had her purse stolen out of her car at a hotel. And in her purse, she had the normal stuff, her driver's license, credit cards, but she also had all of her children's Social Security numbers inside her purse. And the reason that she had them there is because she wouldn't remember the numbers. And in case she needed the numbers, she wanted to make sure she had it with her. And the thing is, that's a risky thing to do. You just want to be extra careful with that information. Another thing that happens with children's information is that sometimes it needs to be shared with a spouse. Like maybe you need to share it with your spouse, and so it might be placed in some type of common location, stored in a drawer or something like that. And now what people will do is they'll maybe store it in a phone or on an online cloud services provider, someplace where both people can see the information if they need it. And the thing you want to think about in terms of storing your child's personal information is if you do something like create them as a contact in your phone and you put it in there, what if your phone gets stolen? Also, with most of your apps that are on the phone, contacts especially, even though you enter it in on the phone, it's actually saved up onto a third-party server. So the information, if you enter it in a contact on your phone, it's actually saved on Google servers. If you store it in something like a note-taking app, Evernote or something like that, all that information is actually uploaded to a third-party server. So you just want to be very cautious and think carefully about where you store your children's personal information. You want to try and keep that secure. Also, you want to think about who you disclose that information to. If you're dealing with someone who says that they need your children's personal information, you want to ask them, do you really need that? Can you use something else to identify my child? Can you use just the last four? Do you need the full Social Security number? Because what can happen is the information gets provided to a third party, and then if the third party is hacked or breached, then their information can be exposed that way. So that's very important. Just think carefully about securing your child's PII. Also, you want to limit online access for very young children. As Tracy mentioned, education can help a lot in terms of reducing your risk. So you don't necessarily need to restrict access completely. But for very young children who aren't aware necessarily of the dangers, you want to maybe limit their access to some online services, limit their access to use some of these services that allow direct messaging until it's absolutely necessary for them to have access to that. We talked already about limiting disclosures by parents to third parties. You also want, as a major thing, you want to talk to your kids about identity theft. And both Eugenia and Tracy mentioned this, and they're absolutely correct. Just like you tell your kids not to open the door if it isn't someone they don't know, just like you tell them to look both ways if they cross the street, you want to make sure you explain to your kids that when they're going onto their device, it feels safe because there's no physical danger, but it can be very dangerous because you don't always know who's on the other end. You want to let them know about potential scams, that there will be people who could contact them, who could send them a text message, send them an email, even call them, and just try and pretend to be someone they're not, pretend to be the police, pretend to be this, just to try and get their personal information. You want to explain to your children about password security, things like not using the same password for everything. A child may not realize how dangerous it could be to have all their passwords be the same thing. You want to make sure to explain to them why that's not something they should ever do. They should have a different password for every service. And ideally, I mean, you want to limit the number of services that you sign up for, limit the number of third-party companies who have your personal information. You don't need to sign up for every contest. You don't need to join every group. You don't need to install every app. You want to kind of let your kids know this, because every time they go and they provide their information to this provider or that provider, they are taking a risk. And the risk may not be realized until much later. You want to explain to them about device security. If you're a kid, you might not realize how dangerous it could be to give someone your phone. Someone asks you for your phone, you probably give it to them unless someone has told you. That could be risky. I mean, what if they do something with your phone? What if they install an app? What if they lose your phone? You want to explain to your children that device security is important. They shouldn't just leave their phone out. They should have some type of password protection. And ideally, you want to configure your child's devices so that you can have them locked down or bricked. If, for example, if the device is stolen, you want to have the service that will let you erase everything on the device. You want to make sure that's installed for your child's devices. Also, you want to explain to your children just not to disclose their personal information in any case, not just on their devices, but to anyone in any situation. And think about when they're signing up for a contest, signing up for or registering for an app, signing up for a service, how much of their personal information are they disclosing? You want to explain to them that things like date of birth should be, ideally, you wouldn't want to disclose that on a service unless it's absolutely necessary. Does a service really need your date of birth? Why do they need that? I mean, they could potentially provide a date of birth that's not their actual date of birth.
And I'll chime in really quick on this one here, Malcolm, in particular, because I think thus far when we've been talking about this with children, in my mind, especially even when I first read the report, I often am thinking about small kids because I have small kids. So I'm thinking, toddlers, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, and 2 weeks ago, I was on the phone with my niece and she was showing me something in her social media and she had a picture of her driver's license in there. And I was terrified. I was like, oh my gosh, take that down. And she's like, what? And I mean, I do this every day. She's aware of what I do. And it just never clicked for her. And so I think, she's a young adult. And so I think we're talking children here, but I think, use that contextually. Younger adults that are still children in some ways, I think it's important to also make sure we're being mindful and educating them. We talk about, the dangers of, particularly in college, of things to be safe when you're going out to parties and things like that. This is also a topic that you should be having with kids once they're no longer in the home and you're not able to monitor as closely what they're doing on their social media, for example, but just reinforcing and reminding them and reiterating, why you don't want to put, it seems common sense, but why you don't want to have your driver's license up online, that your driver's license number means something, that your date of birth means something. So again, no one is immune to this sort of stuff. And I think a lot of it's going to be repetition as well, just kind of hearing it over and over again so that it'll sink in. And to your point, sharing these scams and these stories so that children will understand, tangibly what those repercussions could be. Yeah,
definitely. And I'd like to, can I build on that for just a second, Malcolm? Because I think Eugenia makes a good point. We talked about the education and the role that, not just parents and guardians, but educators should play too. I'm thinking back, Eugenia, and I'm really going to date myself, but I remember being a freshman in college and, you had there were courses that were kind of mandated, for a semester just to kind of help you get acclimated to like being away from home, right? And maybe we should tie in some of this type of education for those young adults who are away from home for the first time too.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
So sorry, Malcolm, we kind of threw you off a little bit.
No problem. Let's see. So next thing I think was on here was lockdown devices. So there are apps and tools that you have to lock down your child's devices. I think they come standard with the iPhone, and then on Android there are different apps that you can buy that will basically let you restrict the types of activities that your children can do on the devices. So restrict things like installing apps, making purchases, using the internet. And so what you really want to look at is locking down the devices for children maybe in junior high school. I think when kids get into high school, they have kind of more of a need to fly on their own, and you just want to make sure they're educated. But especially for younger children, you just want to try and lock down the devices as much as possible. That'd be a good idea. Another thing is thinking about limiting your child's access to their own personal info. For example, does your child really need to know their own social security number? What use would a child have for that if they're not planning on applying for a job, applying for credit? your child probably does not need that information until they're much older. And so by restricting their own access to that, it's not something they can provide. So that's something to keep in mind as well. As far as payment accounts, for younger children, I would recommend that you have them use your own account. Maybe add them as an additional card holder on a credit card account, or set up an account for them where you have access to the account itself so that you can receive alerts about payments that are being made and things like that until children are old enough to manage their own account security. Because that way you would get any alerts on the account if you do it that way. Now, as far as external actions, there are two main ones. The first is what we already talked about, what Eugenia did, which is the right thing. Get a child credit freeze. It doesn't cost any money to get a credit freeze. You can get a credit freeze fairly easily. The key with the what a credit freeze does is it actually locks any potential credit activities, new credit activities on your child's credit file. Children under the age of 16 should not have a credit file. They don't have a credit file, but if someone gets a hold of your child's social security number and there's no credit freeze, then they could potentially set up credit accounts in your child's name. And what would happen is that then when you go to actually apply for credit in your child's name for something like a credit card or a student loan or something like that, you'd find out that they wouldn't get approved because there are other accounts that someone has already set up. And so if you go in and put the credit freeze in place for your child when they're very young, maybe even at birth, then that would preclude that from happening. And so that's highly recommended. What you do want to do is, even if you have a credit freeze for your child, when they turn 16, you want to go and check with the credit bureaus and see if they do have a credit file. They shouldn't if you have a credit freeze, but especially if you don't have a credit freeze for a child, you definitely want to check at 16 and see if they have a credit file, again, which they shouldn't, because if they do have one, that means it's very likely that someone has committed identity theft in their name. And so you'd want to work at resolving that so that when they turn 18 or when they need to apply for a loan, a student loan at 17 or something, they aren't blocked from doing that because of nefarious activity on their credit file. So that's recommended. A big key with the credit freeze is that you want to make sure you place it with all three credit bureaus. You can't just place it with one bureau. You need to make sure you place it with Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. You do need to do it separately for all three, but once you've done that, it'll be in place and you just can rest a little easier. The other thing you want to think about is looking at obtaining some type of identity and cyber protection service for your child or for your family or for your children. The reason is that with these data breaches that we've been talking about, where a company gets hacked into and the information that they've stored about their customers gets stolen, what generally happens with that is that the people that steal the information, they don't actually use it themselves. What they do is they turn around and they sell it to other criminals on the dark web. And so there are services available that will allow you to actually monitor your child's information on the dark web to see if their personal information pops up as having been exposed in a data breach. Because again, what these thieves will do is they'll steal the information first, then when they try and sell it on the dark web monitoring services can send you an alert to let you know that your children's information was exposed. We talked briefly about the Facebook data breach. So all that information that was stolen from Facebook eventually showed up on the dark web. If you had a dark web monitoring service, you probably got an alert for your own personal information. Children's information was stolen also. And so if you have a dark web monitoring service in place to monitor your child's information, you can set it up to receive alerts if your child's information is exposed in one of these data breaches. And so that's an essential tool that I would strongly recommend. Just because kids are signing up for all these services, they're signing up for contests, they're signing up for apps to get free food and all this other stuff. And they're basically disclosing a lot of their personal information whenever they sign up. And so with the dark web monitoring service, you can actually get an alert so that you can find out that their information is out floating around out there for sale. Someone's trying to sell your child's information. And the other thing to think about is that it's not just social media services, school system databases, doctors' offices, they're also targets of identity thieves. One of the largest companies, cloud service companies that provides services to K-12 schools was actually hacked maybe a year and a half ago, and a bunch of their subscriber information was stolen. And so the thing is, all that information that's in there, you think, oh, it's a school, it's going to be secure. Well, they're trying to make it secure, but identity thieves are often very sophisticated, and in many cases, they're organized, highly organized groups of people, and they target specific types of systems. I remember a couple of years ago, the doctor's offices were being targeted very heavily. kept getting calls about people being exposed because their information was breached at their doctor's office. And it's not accidental, right? I mean, these groups are going, they're looking to find large medical practices, and then they'll actively target those practices because they know that a doctor's office has a lot of personal information in there. Insurance information, social security number. I mean, there's a lot of personal information in there. So they'll target doctors' offices, they'll target schools, and they will also target social media companies. But data breaches are something that are very broad in terms of how many different types of systems and organizations are affected. So I would just think about those two actions from an external standpoint. And I guess that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hope that information was useful.
Yeah, a lot to take in there, but again, we'll be sending the recording out for folks to have a look at if they need to kind of again, I think repetition is going to be important here. So just getting more familiar with the actions that they can take is going to be helpful. Before we move into the Q&A portion, because we're coming up on 40 minutes in, I think this would be a good time to have another poll question. So how often do you talk with your child about internet safety? Regularly, at least once a week, often, particularly after an incident has occurred, seldom. I let my child come to me with questions, or never. And we'll leave it open for about a minute. I think while we're waiting for folks to respond, Tracy, this will be a good time to maybe give a quick note around, I know there was some information in the research that you guys did around what's kind of the appropriate time or age group to start to have conversations with children about internet safety. You want to speak to that quickly?
Yeah, so we found that if you try to educate children when they're too young, and Malcolm kind of touched on this as well, it's not effective, right? Because they're just too young to really understand what you're telling them. But if you wait until they're too old, then they've developed these bad habits that are really hard to break as they hit young adulthood and then eventually move out and go on their own. So we found that the kind of sweet spot is really like that 9 to 10 age range, maybe 8 to 10, where children, are old enough to really understand, when you tell them about the dangers of online activity, they're able to understand that. And then we find that if you kind of hit them in that sweet spot of that 8, 9, 10 years, then by the time they become teenagers, 13, 14, 15, they're much less likely to have personal information compromised in a data breach or to suffer from identity fraud because they learned those safe behaviors.
Awesome. Yeah, and I was surprised to hear the number was 8 to 10. I thought it was going to be older, so I think that's good for me to know that earlier than I expected is better. Looking at the results here, really good to see that nobody said never, so I think that is a good thing. Obviously, we have a decent majority here that says after an incident, or seldom they let their child come to them with questions or concerns. So we'd certainly like to see those numbers teeter more closely to a regular basis, preemptively before a situation happens. But I think the fact that there's dialogue happening at all is a good thing. And I think, again, the more that, we can take these opportunities once a child does get to that 8 to 10-year-old age, to regularly dialogue with them, most certainly, as you mentioned, Tracy, to figure out how do we get this as a part of the education system as well, to have this dialogue as well about internet safety is probably going to be a good thing as well, so that the responsibility is not solely on the parent, but also on teachers and things like that, and other places that children are spending a considerable amount of time. Let everybody kind of pitch in and help with those conversations. So good to see that nobody is in the never bucket, but certainly want to make it a bit more frequent of a conversation. So want to just mention, now we do still have time if folks want to put questions into the chat box. We have the opportunity to take some questions from anybody that has any. And just checking here on my end to see if we have any. Don't be shy, folks. So Tracy, Is a child identity fraud protection something that consumers want to get from other providers, like maybe their banks or credit unions, for example? Did your research speak to any of that?
Yeah, so one of the things that we have found, and I think it's kind of been a theme that we've all been talking about here on this webinar, is that oftentimes parents or guardians don't really know what to do, and they don't really know what services are out there. And really, it's unfortunate, but it's not until after they have an incident that they quickly find out, right? And we have found in our research that oftentimes when a child's identity is compromised and it results in fraud, one of the first places parents will turn to is their primary financial institution. And so we do find that, oftentimes that's where they're going for advice. And so we have been encouraging, just, as a community, to have banks and credit unions either offer an identity protection service as part of an overall offering security empowerment that they provide to their customers and members, or to educate them, point consumers in the right direction when they do turn to a primary financial institution for advice about how to protect themselves. Because identity protection services, just, to what Malcolm was saying, really do make a difference. I mean, oftentimes they include the dark web monitoring. They can help with credit freezes. They really just are a good resource for information. And in today's environment, it's something that I think a safeguard that we would all want to have, right? Because it's much better to protect yourself and prevent the fraud in the first place.
Absolutely. So I don't see any more questions coming through, but I think with the time we have remaining, it might be good to just ask for a few final thoughts or final takeaways from both you and Malcolm. So Tracy, I'll let you start.
Yeah, well, I think that the main thing that's kind of been the overarching theme, that you've shared, Eugenia, and that I've shared and Malcolm has shared, is that, education really does play a very important role. And I love the way that Malcolm, put it. You can still see it here on the slide. You wouldn't open the door for someone you don't know, right? So why would you accept a friend request from someone you've never met in person? I think these just very basic fundamental truths hold true in this cyber environment that we live in today. So just educating children, I think, is number one. Number two is, I think, we really do probably as an industry need to do a better job of getting everyone rallied behind this, right? So, maybe this is even something that social media platforms should be involved with, helping to educate children about the risks. Our school systems need to be involved in helping to educate children about the risks, especially as it seems, we're in 2 years of a global pandemic, that remote learning is not something that's going to be going away. And I think you made a very good point, Eugenia, that, these risks don't just disappear when a child turns 18, right? And oftentimes, if they aren't educated at that sweet spot, around the age between 8, 9, and 10, they're going to develop really bad, social media, internet behaviors, and those are going to carry through with them when they go away to college, which could put them in even greater risk later in life.
For sure. And Malcolm, before we pass it over to you, we actually got another question that came in that I think would be helpful to address. So what are the procedures for freezing a child's credit? If you could give a brief overview of it.
Basically, what you want to do is contact each credit bureau individually. If you go to their website and go to the search box and just type in credit freeze, each credit bureau has slightly different procedures for placing a freeze. But what you want to do is contact each of the 3 credit bureaus, Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax, and go to their credit freeze instructions page and follow the instructions for placing a child credit freeze. Basically, what they'll do is they'll first verify your identity, make sure, and then they'll require proof from you that you're authorized to place a credit freeze for a particular child. And so depending on the credit bureau, it could be different items that they'll request. For some of them, they may be able to have you do it online. But basically, they'll get the proof from you that you're authorized to freeze this child's credit, and then they'll place the freeze on the child's credit. And in some cases, they'll give you a special PIN that you'll need to lift the freeze later. You just want to retain that for your records, and then your child's freeze is in place. And that's all there is to it. It's pretty straightforward. The big thing is you just want to make sure that you place it with each of the 3 credit bureaus individually. That's an important step. If you just place the freeze with one bureau, then your child will have a freeze just with that bureau, but you want to make sure to place it with each of the 3 credit bureaus individually.
Thank you. And then we have another, do kids automatically get their social security number? Don't parents have to apply for it? Speaking as someone who just recently had another child, if I remember this correctly, and Tracy or Malcolm, feel free to chime in and tell me if I'm off target here, but I'm pretty sure that they will get it. I think you have to pay if you want to get, you know, the copy of the record, like the Social Security card in the mail, so that you know what the number is. But that information, when a child is born, the birth certificate information, there, you know, the I think it's certification of live birth or something that they call it, that gets submitted to the Social Security Administration, and a number is generated. So it, you know, the number is generated regardless of whether you actually request to get the card or not. But am I off there, Malcolm or Tracy? I'm 99% sure that's the way that it worked.
Yeah, I actually don't know. I thought it was automatic. If your child is born in the United States.
Yeah,
the
numbers.
Born outside the U.S., I believe it's not automatic and you have to request it. But I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, and I was actually going to say, so my son just turned 4, and when we left the hospital, they had actually given me the Social Security number and some of the paperwork, but when I got home, I couldn't find it because you know how chaotic it is after you have a baby oftentimes. So I did have to actually contact the Social Security office. I had to go in person to get another copy of his Social Security number. So yes, Eugenia, you know, you are correct.
Yeah.
One thing I'll add is that you also want to make sure to secure your birth certificate when the child is born, because if someone has the birth certificate, they could potentially go and use it to obtain another Social Security card or other things. So.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add to the credit freeze discussion too, you do have to have, you know, your child's birth certificate handy. So I know a lot of us don't keep those on hand. So that's just something that you'd want to make sure that you, but to Malcolm's point, you should really know where the birth certificate is just to keep it safe. But yeah, you do have to have that information to put the freeze on.
Yeah, and I just remember that I mentioned that because I know my parents, they used to actually keep our birth certificates in the photo album. That would be the first page of the photo album. Be the birth certificate. You don't want to do that.
Yeah.
To keep it secure.
How times have changed, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, so any final thoughts from you, Malcolm, before we close out?
I know, just be safe out there. I think the big key is that the world has changed, and kids today are involved in a lot of interactions with people geographically dispersed across a broad range of ages, much more broad than it was, at least when I was growing up. They're talking to people all over the world. They're exchanging messages with people of all different age groups and interests, and they're just coming into contact with a lot more people through their phone, through their device, through their services that they use, and they really don't understand the potential dangers. And I think, as Eugenia and Tracy said, you really need to make sure to talk to your kids about that, because there's a lot going on out there that they may not be aware of.
Absolutely. And one final question before we close. It says, which countries are more exposed to child ID theft in your experience? I will take this first and just say that that is not something we've researched globally, so I can't speak to it for each, you know, other countries outside of the U.S. And Tracy, I think this study here that you guys did is just for the U.S. So if you know of any information outside of the U.S., but I would say in general, the identity theft and fraud overall, the other countries outside of the U.S. are certainly less mature or knowledgeable about the topic of identity theft and fraud, but that is rapidly changing. I would say even within the past 2 or 3 years, we're starting to see a lot more prevalence, because we do offer our services globally and throughout Europe, in Canada, and lots of other countries. And I would guesstimate that child ID theft would be no different in that instance. I think the U.S. certainly has a head start. I can't, again, speak to any specific numbers there to say which countries would be the highest, but I would say in terms of maturity of exposure to identity theft and fraud in general, the U.S. is probably at the you know, up there at the top of the list, just because we have been exposed to this a lot more than other countries. But the gap is rapidly closing. Malcolm or Tracy, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just say this: the study that we did, you're right, Eugenia, was of U.S. households only. But I will just say anecdotally, I'm in total agreement with you that I think that the gap is kind of narrowing. But historically, you know, U.S. consumers have been just the ones who are more targeted, right? Because typically, you know, U.S. households have more income, right? And so then their personal information would carry more value on the dark web, but that's not necessarily the case so much anymore, especially when we look to Europe and, you know, Canada and things like that. So
yeah, and the US tends to be a lot more, I would say, credit focused and credit reliant maybe than some other countries. So even the concept of identity theft and fraud, or the types of identity theft and fraud, can vary widely depending on what other countries you're talking about, just because they don't utilize credit in other countries in the way that we do here in the US. So hopefully that was some help to the listener that asked that question. So as we get ready to close out, we have just a few minutes left here. I want to, first of all, thank our speakers again for their participation in sharing such valuable information and resources around this topic. And then thank everybody today in the audience for taking the time to join us. If you have any questions that we didn't have time for, or that you think of afterwards, I'm notorious for that. 5 minutes later, I'm like, oh, I should have thought to ask that. Please send us an email at irismarketing@irisidentityprotection.com. And be sure to follow us on social media. We can be found on Facebook and Twitter at the handle Iris ID Protect, and LinkedIn via our company page. On the screen here, Iris powered by Generali. We are always sharing the most recent news and resources as it relates to identity and cyber protection. So be sure to follow us to stay updated, and hopefully it can be a mechanism for dialogue with your children to be able to give them this educational information. Sometimes it's difficult to figure out how to start those conversations, and some of the information that we're sharing online might be a good way to get the conversation started. So again, thank you all for your time today, and we hope to see you guys at one of our next events.
Thanks a lot, Eugenia.
yeah, thank you.